got some bright-eyed, bushy tails. See a lot of people that I recognize out there, so thanks for coming, and a lot of new faces, so I'm looking forward to getting to meet some of you. As Sean said, my name's Dave, and I am the executive director and founder of the Swartz Center for Entrepreneurship, and really would like to thank Sophia today for sponsoring the event. Greg Katikia is a member of the Carnegie Mellon family, and so we're really proud that you're working with us today. It's my honor to actually introduce a friend of mine who I've known since 1989. He actually gave me an offer to come to work for Heinz, and I seriously considered it because he's a really cool guy. But I had the bug to start a company, so I went a different direction. But I made sure to stay in touch with Tony over the years. Tony is a Carnegie Mellon and Tepper alum. He has been a senior executive, CEO, board chair for over 3 decades at brand name food companies that you all know: Heinz, Diamond Crystal Brands, Harry's Foods, Kettle Cuisine, Ferrara Foods, and more. And there's a new one on the horizon, I understand. So we're excited about that. And Tony really excels and thrives on transforming these food and beverage companies into strong, financially healthy organizations, and having to reach their full potential. His wheelhouse is professionalizing and scaling these companies of all different sizes. So we're going to contrast a public giant today in Heinz versus some of the private equity-backed companies that he had ran. But it's all really been about innovation and how to make these companies competitive in highly competitive markets. And so he's very team-oriented and really builds his team and gives his teams credit. As we were preparing for this today, almost every other sentence was talking about his team members and how wonderful they were and how they made it all happen. So that'll be part of it. So please join me in welcoming Tony Muscato today to today's forum.
Thanks, Dave. Can everybody hear me? Good. Good to hear. I'm really thrilled to be here. I love working with Dave. I love working with the school. I just am constantly amazed at what goes on, and I'm a very restless and curious person, and so this is just a natural fit for what I love to do. You're doing terrific work at Swartz, by the way, setting people up to succeed. Not only the students, but your families and the colleagues you have, and then more importantly, the community. So I'm really thrilled to be here. And if you ask me why I'm here, it's that's one reason. The other is I'm always looking for great talent. I've always built a talent well, and networking is a number one way of doing that, and this is a great fertile ground for that. As Dave said, I've spent 20 years inside the Heinz company. I was in the U.S. and Europe at different roles. I went to Heinz on the day after graduation. So 2 days after graduation, actually. We graduated on a Saturday, and on Monday I was at the desk. I wasn't traipsing around Europe with friends. But long story short is I went to Heinz because it was a great place to learn the classics, classic marketing from my perspective. It was also a good place to work with terrific people. And really, when I think back, I was taught what good looks like. You need to keep that with you throughout your career in any position, any opportunity that you have. But I started in marketing, worked through various levels of the organization, went into the sales role. It's hard to think about a marketer in front of customers, but it worked out okay. And then the last half of my career at Heinz, I was in senior roles in the U.S. and in Europe, and running businesses along the way. And I had that entrepreneurial bent myself, even though I ran the ketchup business. I also really loved running the middle market companies, making acquisitions, and then getting dropped in, building a team, putting a playbook in place, and helping those middle market companies grow. And that's really where my passion rested. And frankly, one of the things that gave me a lot of opportunity to learn an awful lot along the way. So it wasn't just about marketing, it was about finance and operations and supply chain. So really for me, that set me up, and we'll talk in a bit about the private equity world and why I went into it.
Yeah, thank you. You talked a little bit about the pivot you made in your career, going from a senior executive at a giant publicly traded company into these middle market private equity backed companies. So appreciate that. But so what at the highest level, what was the difference in the innovation environment going from Heinz to, say, Diamond Crystal Brands, and how would you compare and contrast it? We'll dive a little bit deeper later, but what are some of the high level observations?
Well, it's a large company with an awful lot of resources, a lot of different ideas, a very robust process, great research, a good project management system, great tools, terrific people to work with. But in a very large organization, it's very difficult to move quickly. And the market was changing very quickly. I mean, away from the center of the grocery store toward food away from home. It was moving toward refrigerated, better for you, clean labels, healthier foods all along. And as we started to see, it wasn't very easy for us to pivot. And I also saw this as an opportunity because as someone who had an entrepreneurial bent and had run a lot of middle market companies, and I'd like to be closer to my customers, I saw it as an opportunity to really get out in front and go after some of those new markets, and frankly, with capabilities that were very different than the Heinz company had. Now, I will say one thing, in full disclosure, I ran some M&A work inside of Heinz, and so we were making quite a few acquisitions along the way. And I remember before I went to Europe on a Friday, I bought a company. And I said to myself after that, it was sort of one of those trigger points, one of those pivotal moments where I want to be on the receiving end someday when someone buys my company. And so that gave me a lot of inspiration to get moving forward and to change direction.
Cool. Well, why don't we just jump into that sort of compare and contrast, and let's start with Heinz. While you were at Heinz, what's an innovation or a product that you're most proud of? And can you tell us how it was conceived, how it was sold to the C-suite, the challenge that you faced in executing it, and ultimately what was the impact that it had at Heinz?
I brought a few props, not many. Great question. Well, look, in my career, one of the things that I've learned is that you don't have permission for the long term unless you succeed in the short term. All the strategy in the world, all the vision you have in the world isn't going to make a difference if you can't succeed today. And particularly, you've got to be focused on growth, both the bottom and top line. And innovation is one of those big growth levers that are very important for us. And I thought maybe it's best just to give you a good example along the way. I've worked on quite a few different innovation projects. These were some of the big brands that I was a part of. A few won very big and a few didn't. But Upside Down Ketchup was a product that we launched in the early 2000s. And I was running the food service division at the time. I was group vice president of North America. And we were really starting to see a lot of competitive inroads in that segment. And this is the segment of the market where you go into a restaurant and you see tabletop ketchup. Well, tabletop ketchup over time was getting tired, and one of the reasons was because there were a lot of issues in the trade on cost. So how do you add more value to keep that presence for the Heinz brand on the tabletop? So when I was in Europe, we had bumped into quite a few different packages. They're very, very strong in Europe in developing new packages and innovating in the food categories. And upside-down bottles were the rage. Someone from Europe brought the upside-down bottle to the U.S. In the marketing group. But more importantly, in food service, how could we keep that tabletop presence? Well, the insight that we had was that on the tabletop, the bottle looked unsightly. We had legs of ketchup going down the side. We had big restaurant chains that were very worried about the quality and the image they were presenting. We were worried about bacteria in the bottle. There's a big issue with refilling bottles with cheaper ketchup or different from bulk containers into individual packages. So it was very unsightly, big issue, and big chains like Applebee's, 2,000 units, did not want to worry about their labor staff refilling ketchup bottles. So the insight we had was that let's take that upside-down bottle, which is a lot easier to dispense ketchup, and make a couple of changes to the packaging. And technology played a great role in this. The first was we created what we called Forever Full. So we made the exterior, the bottle itself, put a layer of red coloring in it so you couldn't see how much was in the bottle itself on the tabletop. The next thing we did is made the cap non-removable. So once you pulled that cap off, you couldn't refill it. We also, looking for very different value along the supply chain, found a way to make it very attractive for distributors, food service distributors that ship to restaurants, to distribute the product by upsizing the case pack. And so a lot of large chain restaurants pay on a per piece basis their freight. And so it's cost them the same to ship 24 bottles as it would 30. So all those things came together, and with a good senior sponsor, throughout the organization and support with the team in many different areas of the company, from the operations group that had to make it work in some of our facilities to the R&D team that were working iteratively to continue to refine the package before we launched it. It made a big difference. We were able to fight the competition off. We grew the top line on this category about 12%, and it's a $200 million business. It's the second largest category, most profitable inside of Heinz. And so it was a great outcome for everybody, including the shareholders.
I was looking out at the audience as you were telling that story, and it took me back to my days as a kid going to restaurants and seeing the waiter or waiters come over and refill it. And I always thought, that's gross. And as I looked out there, people were cringing and remembering that story. But one important piece of that was that sponsorship. I don't think at that point in time we're in the C-suite. You ultimately were C-suite at Heinz. How did you get that sponsorship from above, and how did you continue to keep them involved with the process?
So throughout my career, one of the, we'll talk in a minute about notes to my younger self, but one of them was just making certain that you keep that network open. And, one of the things I learned at school, I think it was called the trash can theory of management here at the time, which was there are solutions everywhere. You just need to find the problem to apply it to. And I've always kept track of things that I see that might have a great application in certain situations. And so at the time, I relied on the network that I had created inside the company. And it wasn't just about marketing. It wasn't just about customers, because I could pick up the phone and talk to customers to get their input. But I really used the different functional areas across the company at all levels to have champions for what we were trying to get accomplished. And we'd celebrate that success, use that same team on other projects. But without that, working closely together, it just really would have ended up in a very different spot.
Who was the sponsor back in those days? A lot of Pittsburghers.
Well, at the time, I was reporting to Joe Jimenez.
Okay.
He was the head of Heinz North America, and he was a big consumer advocate. In fact, he was my boss in Europe as well. That didn't hurt at all. And he went on to do great things as well. But put yourself in front of great people, and you're going to learn. Absolutely. That's always been my mantra.
Thinking back on that innovation, which is amazing. I mean, it's part of our everyday life, so I can relate to that. What was the biggest hurdle? What was the biggest challenge? And I'm sure this was a multi-year process that you went through. And how did you address that challenge?
It's more about having a great project. Up front, I do a lot of work to plan with the end in mind. Mm-hmm. And I want to identify what's the insight that we're trying to solve. What's the problem? And throughout that, let that be your compass. And that's what the team starts to focus on. And it's what invites resources, what invites great execution throughout. One of the benefits of being in a large company is a lot of cash and a lot of support, portfolio of ideas everywhere. But you've got to be really smart about which ones move forward. And if you get outside of your comfort zone, which is about capabilities, all of a sudden it's awfully hard to shift. I mean, I've never found in a large company it easy to build capabilities quickly. And those are capabilities that you need that sync up with your strategy and what you're trying to accomplish. This was right in our wheelhouse. And so it involved a little bit of a pivot, and with people that were really sharp, knew their business incredibly well. And I just helped with the team to sprinkle in a little bit of a different way of thinking about this and how this could actually ultimately help customers. And one of those funny things in your career, when you succeed once, you start to build some momentum and some confidence in the organization, and so they trust you more. And so from my perspective, I loved Heinz because you ran a business, but they also gave you enough rope to hang yourself so you could try new things and push the envelope a little bit. And I think people appreciated that in a large company, which was more slower to move, relied on its brand, and less about being nimble and responsive.
I hear in that a lot of persistence, right? Persistently making sure that the key stakeholders were aware of the benefit, and you're being transparent about the challenges along the way, and that's a really, really important part of making it.
It's very important. Persistence throughout any one of these different initiatives, wherever the inspiration came from, whatever the insight was, you had to keep believing in what it was you were trying to accomplish. It didn't mean you didn't course correct along the way, but it needed that project sponsor at many different levels to succeed.
Yeah, thank you. Well, let's do the contrast now, right? You know, that's a story of how you achieve something great in a large organization. And a few years later, you're now the CEO running these middle market food companies who have lots of headroom, lots of opportunity. You know, tell us about a project at Diamond Crystal or Harry's where, you know, for better or worse, you know, you've had a different set of challenges, a different environment, and how did that work?
Sure. Well, to think about private equity, a lot of different private equity firms have many different playbooks, but they do have some things in common. And two factors that you have to keep in mind when you're in the world of private equity is, number one, they measure return as an IRR and MOIC, money on invested capital. The second thing is that you have a window of opportunity where you have to show value quickly. And so there's usually an investment made for a 3 to 5 year period. The private equity firm is looking for opportunities that are in certain industries that they'll specialize in. And you've got 3 to 5 years to really make the best to improve value. And you know, I've always gravitated toward those PE firms that like to grow businesses, that are more receptive to innovation. But within that 3 to 5 year period, it's a cycle of investment. So the private equity firm is much more willing up front to take risks. But through the course of the investment, toward years 3 to 5, they start to throttle back a little bit. And they do that simply because the ROI is going to accrue to the next owner, not the current owner. So it's important to keep both of those factors in mind when you're designing a product or an innovation or any kind of initiative throughout a company, because you're going to be more likely to get the capital you need up front and later on less likely. So what that means, in my view, was you focus more not on category breakthroughs, but you focus more on incrementalism, you focus more on building on the capabilities that you have, you focus on gaining share, and you may go into adjacent food categories, but you're never going to try to reinvent a category within the time frame that you have. And so that's the focus that we brought to Harry's Fresh Foods. Harry's was a refrigerated soups and sauces company. I competed against them at Heinz for an awful long time. They were very good at innovating, but they had been purchased by Basic American Foods, which was, for all things, a dehydrated potato company. I have no idea why they got themselves into an on-trend category like refrigerated butter for you foods, but they did. But that was our opportunity, and we carved that business, made the acquisition in 2010, carved the business out, and quickly put a value thesis and plan together. And the idea was, how do we maximize, since we're on the clock during that time period? So one of the things that I really liked about this business, besides being on trend, was that we ended up in a category that was very difficult for a lot of big players to follow. Heinz could never get into this category. In fact, they started a couple of incubators on the side to figure out how we could go after this business. But their innovation and from customers, when I was out for the first 90 days, was stellar. They created this halo for themselves. They were always bringing in new products for restaurant operators, for food service distributors. And so what we did is leverage that, and we started to expand, getting back to the deeper into our core categories of soups and sauces, on-trend products in packages that made a difference in sectors beyond just the club channel that most of Harry's business had been focused on. We had a great facility. It just had not been run very well, and it needed a leadership team that was more focused on innovation and growing the top and bottom line. And so we put that team together, made some investments in some key areas, launched some products that you may still well see today. We also used the same capabilities that we had in refrigerated foods to get into different day parts. So we got into breakfast with oatmeal. We got into an entree category with refrigerated entrees through the Kroger network on products that were just easy to heat, because there's still a lot of cooking illiteracy out there, and people don't make things from scratch anymore, and they want things on the go. So this was a way for us to take the capabilities that we had in the time frame to grow the business and apply them to different markets, different products, and frankly, in different food categories.
You mentioned incrementalism, but that doesn't sound incremental.
No,
it sounds like you really grew the business dramatically.
We did. We had tripled the size of the business. We increased EBITDA by 6 times, and after 2.5 years, we had a very small an auction. We had a lot of people from the outside, the very large companies, very interested in what the capabilities of the company were. And it was, as Dave says, it wasn't incrementalism. It was more about staying within the core capabilities that you have, but really leveraging all those capabilities and throughout the process.
Okay, thank you. Well, those are two great examples in two different environments. So given the wisdom and experience that you've accumulated over these years, what advice would you give to the corporate innovators that are here today and for the graduate students that are going to become corporate innovators on how they identify the right projects, how they build the teams, how they sell the ideas, especially given the uncertain macroeconomic environment that we have today, right? We're seeing a lot of large companies do layoffs. We're seeing a lot of important startups close shop. Tony's been a great advisor to a company called Fifth Season that came here out of Carnegie Mellon and hit a capital wall. You've got a really tough environment in front of them. How do they continue to press forward? How do they continue to innovate?
Sure. So, whether you're in a large company or you're in the world of private equity, you can't be confused that you're thinking about the short term, the here and now only. And I mean that. You have to be thinking about how to succeed today, but you also kind of have to set yourself up and figure out where the puck is going, to use a hockey analogy. And there's a couple of things that we could talk a long time about this, and Dave asked me to boil it down. But the first is going back to what I pointed out on Forever Red Ketchup, and that is you've got to have an insight that you're working towards. What's the consumer issue? That's not going to change in any economic environment in a major way. If you know what that insight is and you've done your homework, you've talked to customers, and you stay focused on it. I think the next is make sure the economics add up. I've seen too many situations where hope is a strategy, and people confuse goals with real specific strategy and tactics to make yourself successful in any environment. If you don't have that level of granularity, you can't convince others throughout the process that confidently you can execute. You're not going to invite the resources that you need to succeed at each step of the way. I think the other is that, from my perspective, make sure you've got the right capabilities to win. And make sure they're synced up with your strategy. I've seen too many startups and smaller companies that I've been a part of where the real prize is over here and our strategy is somewhere in the middle, but we're kind of thinking about, how do we put all this together over time? How do we provide this on a consistent, repeatable basis? Anytime I'm in a private equity due diligence effort, I look to make sure all those elements are synchronized. And that's how I frankly get private equity firms excited about making the investment. If they know a little bit about the category itself, but I've show the path and show why those things are all synchronized, they get excited and they'll get behind you and support you and sponsor you in any initiatives. And like I said earlier, whether it's the board, and I've been on boards and I've worked with boards, or whether it's someone on the front line in a facility that you're relying on. If you're communicating and how all those things come together on a regular basis, you keep them pretty motivated and inspired. And who doesn't want to be a part of a success story? And that ties people. Gives them a lot of incentive to work late, to think hard, and look, we're going to fail along the way. That's absolutely a given, but it's what you learn, and then how do you pivot and react and get better? And frankly, in the environment of the private equity world, I've found that, again, because the here and now matters. If something's not working, you pivot right away. You stay focused on what you can do really well, or if you're not succeeding, you move. And because cash is constrained in that environment, you've got to be effective and efficient.
Yeah, it makes sense. I hear a consistency throughout your career. It starts with vision. You have to have a team, right? You have to be persistent and communicate, but it's always about leveraging current strengths that you have in new ways that hasn't been thought of before, right? Good.
That's one of the things very early in your career that you don't quite understand. But once you start to realize that those are all important ingredients and you focus on it, then the success is repeatable, a higher probability of winning.
Well, I'd like to open it up to the audience for questions for Tony today. So I'll be the mic runner. I'll be up and down the aisles here. If anybody has a question, if you raise your hand, I'll come and get there. We go.
Thank you. That was a great, a lot of insights. One question I have is, you mentioned that the large companies may not be successful getting into the small equity innovations, like the examples you have here. So the question is, what could have been differently if Heinz wants to do this? Why Heinz couldn't be successful doing this, what the small equity firm can do it?
These are categories. Ignore the whiskey up there. That's an investment of love right now. But each of these categories, these are refrigerated food categories, upper right and in the middle there with Kettle Cuisine's product line. And Heinz is very good at frozen capabilities and shelf-stable, center of the store capabilities. The sales team was very ingrained with the customers in those areas. Any of our R&D folks were always constantly working on either product innovation in these categories or process improvement. That was one of the big reasons the company was so successful. We were able to improve our cost of goods in the facilities, and that was in raw material, that was in labor, that was in throughput, capital investments on automating. So really got the momentum moving forward. And so anytime we went into something with a short shelf life, people were scared. All of our other products were at least 12 months. And not only from a management perspective, but also from a perspective of shipping product to customers. So getting out in this area in refrigerated foods where you have a 45-day shelf life, they just wouldn't look at it. And quarterly pressures, we've got longer-term strategic goals. For us, it was easier to innovate around the edges and also make acquisitions into categories. What you are seeing today in a lot of food companies is the willingness to make investments in incubators that go out and then plant seeds in a lot of the different categories today, especially in the better for you area and refrigerated foods area. Whereas in private equity, again, you're taking an idea that is existing and maybe you're professionalizing the team to be successful, or maybe you're providing the capital that they need to actually develop a product and launch it nationally. Sometimes these smaller companies, family owned or otherwise, don't have the resources, they don't have the management horsepower that's needed. And if you bring someone in who understands that, but can bring the team along with them, and with the capital that comes along with the private equity firm, you can make the investment and you get returns pretty quickly. It's a highly leverageable environment.
Hi, thanks for being here. So Dave, you alluded to it, very tough time to raise capital. What have we learned specifically about some of the failures here locally, and what advice would you give as startups potentially go out and try to raise capital? What have we learned through the process?
Sure. It is a different environment. Beside the market demand slowing down, the interest rates have changed significantly, so the returns you expect from companies have to be greater to support the debt, frankly, over time. And I think it goes to, in good environment, good times when we're growing, the pressures in the environment aren't as great. The word is more about people are more willing to take a chance, and they'll invest and take a longer-term view of things. When I feel in the world of private equity, today deals have slowed a bit, but now what you're seeing is the companies that really aren't strong, they're starting to slow down and they're struggling, whereas the shining stars, the cream rises to the top, especially around ideas. And so from an idea perspective, for me, it's easier to see those that have a great value proposition that are going to win in the market that I'm more willing to get behind. Now, don't get me wrong, there's opportunities out there to find companies that maybe are missing a couple key ingredients to succeed, and that's an opportunity if you can buy it right. But you have to be looking for those and doing your homework. I mean, my feeling is that you never really know what you buy for about 12 months after you buy it. You learn as you go through. But if there's a core nugget of value, even in difficult times, you can succeed through it. I think the other element, too, from my experience is that I do find, especially with younger entrepreneurs, there's less of a willingness to listen. From my perspective, there's nothing wrong in asking for help. There's nothing wrong in saying, I just don't know the answer. But what you have to have is, where do I go to get that answer? Is it my board? Is it the network that I put together myself over time? And what are they telling me? Again, too often, not invented here happens. And I saw it in a large company. People get intoxicated with ideas, and they very slow to move off those ideas. If you don't remain nimble, if you don't keep your mind open for new opportunities in the worst of environments or in the best of environments, you're never going to have that core base of knowledge that you have to succeed. And I've just seen too often, especially with smaller companies, with family-owned companies, because I've sat on the board of this. Michelangelo's was a good example. He was the largest customer I had from tomato products for me, and I left Heinz, and he asked me to sit on his board, and he said, look, we're about a $50 million company, and I want to sell in 5 years. How do I do it? And so I partnered with him and the rest of his team, and we put a playbook together. And he had a great outcome, but he just reached out. He saw somebody he thought he could work with, and we had a good relationship going back to the days when he was my customer. So I'm just want to stress, at an earlier age, any age really, you're developing that network. You got to rely on people. It's not a weakness to ask for help.
Yeah, thanks again for your wisdom. My question is on the previous slide. That red bottle for the ketchup bottle is genius. And so I'm just wondering, did anybody else come up with that idea before and it just wasn't the right time? Yeah.
Well, I know in Spain, that's where we first saw the upside down bottle, but it just took a little foresight from the team to decide, look, we've got this issue here, how can we solve it? And we'd seen a solution, now we had a problem to solve. And that really was the genesis of it. And we had a good team that got the organization behind it, and we got customers behind it. It's very easy when you get one or two large customers excited about a product line for it to snowball and the enthusiasm builds. And by the way, we margined up 5 points too, so I'm happy about that.
Awesome. Just, I think we can get ourselves back on time. Tony, you had mentioned a little bit earlier about notes to your younger self, right? And we have a lot of graduate students here in the audience and a lot of young professionals out there. What do you know now that you didn't know then? And just think of me as a much younger guy than I actually am, and give me some advice on how I should proceed in my career.
Well, when I was here, I didn't have gray hair, but it was earned. Look, I learned a ton along the way from cleaning up the mistakes of others, and more importantly, making my own mistakes along the way. But I've been also taught by some of the best, and very fortunate for that. But I put together my notes to my younger self. Dave asked me to give this some thought, but we've talked a lot about this. I have always surrounded myself with the best talent I could find. And I was making sure that they were challenging me throughout the entire process. I'm a glass is half full guy, so I always make sure I strap a cynic to my belt, who's up at night worrying about the things that I might be overlooking because I'm more optimistic than not. I'm always very clear on roles, responsibilities, and expectations with whomever I work with, whether it's the team or whether it's the individual. What are you going to do? What am I going to do? And how we measure our success along the way. I don't think learning ever ends. You always have to ask the tough questions. And like I said earlier, keep track of solutions, keep a list. You'll find a problem for them. Don't let perfect get in the way of better. I mean, too often I find somebody's looking for the optimal, best, 100% bulletproof answer. And that slows people down. They get overwhelmed. They get static. They'll frankly get paralyzed and overwhelmed. They won't move. I've never been afraid to follow the road less traveled. I've always put myself in tough spots to learn. When I went to Europe, great opportunity for you, Tony. This is a business over there. It's growing, and we just need some leadership. Well, I got over there, and I found out perennially they were losing $10, $15 million a year. It was very complicated business. We'll talk about that in a minute. But it needed just some leadership and guidance. And through that process, I learned a ton, and it set me up down the road for a different experience that a lot of my peers didn't have because I was willing to take the risk. A lot of folks wouldn't. They would have just followed the old status quo. Keep it simple. Complexity chokes execution. It ties up too much resources. You got a big team or small team. If they're not focused on a few simple things to get that accomplished, and you know how big the plate is, and you overwhelm that plate, they'll never win. So keep life simple. Act like an owner. I've always done that, whether I've been inside the big old Heinz company or whether I'm an investor in a company that I'm running. I'm an owner. What would I do that makes sense for our shareholders and for myself? And I take a lot of pride. That's where the persistence comes in. And when you've got capital at risk, I think it focuses your mind a little bit. And then lastly, and there are plenty of other lessons, integrity matters. It's one of the things that Olice Hines used to say about do the right thing. In my view, there's no cost-benefit analysis on integrity. You know, it's about gravity. Either you have it or you don't, and that's your brand. That's what makes a difference. And if investors see that, your team sees that, your customers see that, your family sees that, you'll never go astray, and you'll always win, in my view.
Tony, that's amazing advice. Thank you so much for sharing that today, and thank you for sharing your experiences
You're welcome.
at
Happy
a
to.
large public giant versus private equity companies. I think the compare and contrast is really helpful for us to all think about our current situations and how we can continue to innovate. So join me in thanking Tony. Appreciate it.
Thank you very much. Thank you.